Good day, ladies and gentlemen. Tucker Carlson recently appeared on Joe Rogan's podcast. And among many things, the topic of evolution and creation came up. And Tucker Carlson's answer was really strong. And Joe Rogan was bumbling through his incoherent philosophy, which is normal for him. And we're going to talk about that today from a perspective of what the Catholic Church has actually taught. I want to also say two things before we get started. One, if this is not relevant to you because you couldn't care less about what Joe Rogan says, I don't watch Joe Rogan. I haven't watched his show or listened to it in years. It was something I was into before I started practicing the Catholic faith and realized I really shouldn't be listening to it because there was a lot of filth in it. Another story for another day. Also, I stopped listening to it because I found his philosophy and that of most of his guests to be incoherent and just frustrating. But anyway, this interview with Carlson, who I do like, I do enjoy Tucker Carlson's work. For the most part, I listen to some of his stuff sometimes. And I think he's doing a pretty good job with promoting what really amount to traditional Christian values overall. And a lot of it's even more traditional than you'll find in the average conservative Novus Ordo setting, which I think is great. In any event, this has made the rounds and these things have kind of gone viral on their own. So this has kind of come across my desk and I thought, well, this is fascinating. Let's talk about it. There is some relevance to it. So during their conversation, which I have not watched the whole thing, I'm just seeing these clips. The topic of evolution comes up, and Joe Rogan, from what I recall it's been about 9 years since I really ever listened to him intentionally. He used to always push evolution and all these kinds of things. And I guess he still does believe in it sort of with blind faith, which kind of comes up in this. And Carlson pushes back when he brings it up, and he basically says, there's no proof for our evolution, at least from the Darwinian perspective. And this is fascinating because the way Carlson talks, which I really appreciate, is he just says things apodictically. He just says, no one believes that. That's not true. This is nonsense. And he just kind of says it. And it's interesting to see people respond to that because usually people kind of skirt around the issue and say things like, well, there are reasons why some may conscientiously object to blah, blah, blah. And he just says, no one believes that anymore. We've moved past it. This is balderdash, And it was kind of interesting to see Rogan kind of back on his heels because this notion of evolution being this narrative that it just must be accepted is religious dogma really in the secular world, and no one really questions it. Now, I did just over the last couple months, I've posted at this point 4 interviews on the topic of creation and evolution from a Catholic perspective. And you can find those if you look in my channel. It's not hard. The first one was on the general traditional doctrine of creation with Hugh Owen. The second one was on the age of the universe and the world. Is there reason to dispute the narrative on that with Dr. Kevin Mark? I almost said Dr. Mark Kevin. He's one of those individuals who has 2 first names and one, as last name. And we talked about that and it was a 2.5-hour conversation with tons of citations of things. It wasn't something you just approach with kid gloves. And then I did one with Dr. Wynn, Dr. John Wynn, and he is a collaborator with Hugh Owen and Dr. Kevin Mark. And sorry, he's not Dr. John Wynn. He's not a doctor. He's another distinction. But we talked about hominids and how even the secular literature on hominids is not what we've been taught. Really, well, without getting into it too much right now, before we go into this little clip here, this idea that there were all these transitionary humanoid type things isn't true. What we really have is apes and peoples and different kinds of apes and peoples, and these fossils are not really conclusive at all. And then the fourth one was with Dr. Romulo, who is a PhD in evolutionary biology from Oxford. That's right, a PhD in evolutionary biology from Oxford. And he showed me data where he challenged the Darwinian model of evolution of the species and shows with just the data. Again, this is a man with a PhD in evolutionary biology from Oxford, arguably the most prestigious university in the world. And we did talk about religion a little bit. He is a Catholic, but really the focus on the thing was about the data and how this idea of macroevolution of going from one species to another and this leap and whatever, that's not there in any way that's proven by the science. And furthermore, these transitionary forms and things, that's not there either. So it really is something that's not even reconcilable with the data that we have. And I do have another interview with Hugh Owen going to be coming out hopefully later this week. I've got to do some editing. And we kind of close it out with the really strong Catholic Thomistic perspective on evolution and why that would be difficult to reconcile, if not impossible, with evolutionary theory. So look forward to that. So let's just look at this clip here from our friend Tucker Carlson and Joe Rogan. I'm just going to pull that up, share my screen here. So here is, and there are no swear words, which is very rare for Carlson or not Carlson, but it's very rare for Joe Rogan to not be swearing in an episode, which is one reason why I don't listen to him. But anyway, here we go.
Cares about you, you're important to the people around you.
But if we don't think people are important, then what do we think is important? I guess that's what I'm saying.
Not necessarily that we don't think people are important, but if evolution is real, and if there is this constant, I don't know, but it's visible. Like you can measure it in certain animals.
You can measure adaptation.
Yeah.
But there's no evidence that in fact, I think we've kind of given up on the idea of evolution. The theory of evolution as articulated by Darwin is like kind of not true. Right?
In what sense?
Well, in the most basic sense, the idea that, all life emerged from a single cell organism and over time, and there would be a fossil record of that, and there's not. And
there's not a fossil record of transitionary species, like species that are adapting to its environment.
There's tons of record of adaptation, and you see it in your own life. I mean, I have a lot of dogs. I see adaptation in dogs, through the litter to litter. But no, there's no evidence at all zero, that people evolve seamlessly from a single cell amoeba. No, there's not. There's no chain in the fossil record of that at all. And that's why you don't actually hear people, you hear them make reference to evolution because the theory of adaptation is obviously true. But Darwin's theory's totally, that's why it's still a theory almost 200 years later. No, we have not found that at all. And I can't even guess. I mean, I have my own theories on it, but they're not proven.
What are your theories?
God created people, distinctly, and animals. I mean, I think what every person on Earth thought until the mid-19th century, actually.
Right, but
it's not a new idea.
They didn't have computers. They didn't have a general understanding that we have today of the process.
Do you think we understand more now?
Yes.
Really?
You don't think that we understand more today?
We understand way less. We understand so little that we're actually sitting here allowing a bunch of greedy, stupid, childless software engineers in Northern California to flirt with the extinction of mankind.
That was absolutely beautiful. Tucker Carlson is a gem. Tucker Carlson is an absolute gem. Pray for his conversion, that he becomes a Catholic. I know that he's not really satisfied with his Episcopalianism, because who could be? It's Episcopalianism, and he makes fun of it all the time. Sorry if I have a tickle in my throat, by the way, if my voice gets kind of raspy. In any event, okay, let's break this down. So what's so telling about this in these 2 minutes here is it shows a ton of different factors of this whole evolutionary paradigm. So the first part, the conversation surrounds what context. They're talking about the importance of people. If you look at the episode and you see kind of the context, you can understand what that is more. But we don't even need to, because he goes from talking about the importance of people, and Rogan is making some argument about perhaps there's an expendability of certain individuals. And Carlson says, well, if people aren't important, then what is important? And what is Joe Rogan's response? Joe Rogan's response is, Tucker Carlson's response is, no, I'm confused. Joe Rogan's response to Carlson is, well, it's not that people aren't important, but we have evolution. And there's so much in that statement there. There is so much in that statement. Why? Because the insinuation there is that although we like people, although people are kind of cool, although we are attracted to other human beings and all these things that people experience as things that are distinctly human, really, that's just an evolved version of what all of the animals explain or experience. And there could be a species that will come one day that really doesn't make people as important as they are now. That's really the logic behind that. And this is complete rejection of the idea that man is made in the image and likeness of God. And this is what I find so mind-numbingly frustrating with the neoconservative Catholic crowd that wants to completely hammer home this idea that man has infinite dignity. But at the same time, they are theistic evolutionists, and they don't see the problem with this. The only way man has infinite dignity is if he's elevated by Christ. And that's really the most traditional way to look at it. And even there, it's not that conclusive as far as man has infinite dignity per se. I've talked about this, and great thinkers like Garrigou-Lagrange and stuff have addressed this, and they're much smarter than you or I. They opine that even the Virgin Mary has something like quasi-infinite dignity, but they wouldn't say just infinite, because infinite requires something divine, and human beings, as divinized as they are because of their proximity to the divine through the sacraments and the beatific vision and so forth, even there, that we can't really say the human being is infinite in and of himself in any capacity, because he has a beginning and an end. He doesn't have no beginning and no end, which is what infinity requires. But anyway, so what is inherent in this evolutionary paradigm is that there is a reality where human beings are not the pinnacle of creation. They're not the bee's knees. They're not the cat's meow, as the older crowd would say. And Joe Rogan is right. If there is evolution, then it's not that people aren't important, but, and that but is very important, people are really just evolved animals. And because of that, if we treat people in an animalistic sense, then there's really no problem with that ultimately, even if we find it kind of icky. And it's something that perhaps we should just not talk about and leave to the experts. That's kind of the idea. And that's what you do find. I mean, this is the rationale behind abortion, especially sex-selective abortion. This is the rationale behind population control and contraception. It's like, yeah, people are important, but they're really just an animal as part of this evolutionary scheme. And therefore, if we have to cull the herd the same way that we do with geese or cows or cattle, maybe this is just a sad reality and we're evolved, but we're really not that important. And Rogan says, and then Carlson retorts, is it proven? And funny thing is, the first thing Rogan says, who has talked about evolution 1,000 times, is, well, I don't know. Well, actually, it can be measured in certain animals. What does that even mean, measured in certain animals? Really, what should be said is what Carlson goes on to say, that certain elements of adaptation to circumstances, what we might call microevolution, meaning changes within a certain kind of creature to adapt to an environment, that can be seen. If that's what he means by measured, sure. I mean, Carlson talks about dogs. We see this with other animals as well. This was at the heart of Darwin's idea of the evolution of the species because of the finch beaks. There's certain seeds they have to get in different types of locations for those seeds and pine cones and things, and therefore their beaks will adapt to the various surroundings. Okay, fine. You can see this in human beings too. If you ever, especially if you move to a really northern climate. If you talk to people who have moved to somewhere like the Yukon or Northwest Territories or Alaska, and they have to work with their hands, like they're a mechanic or something, you'll actually see that the tips of their fingers actually expand, and their fingers actually get a lot thicker. And the reason is because the blood vessels necessarily increase in size, so they can pump a lot more blood through, so they can keep the fingers warm, so they can do things in a climate that requires warm fingers in order to function. It's really an adaptation to the circumstance. You find that people who are born in different climates have different reactions. In fact, I remember one individual was telling me he had grown up in Florida, and he goes to a place in Canada for university, and he has donating blood first week of university. They would ask people to donate blood or whatever. And there was something funny with his blood, like it was the texture was strange, and he was worried that something was wrong. And the nurse said to him, "Oh, you came from a hot climate. When did you get here?" And he arrived a week before from Florida. And she said, "Oh, this happens with people. It takes a little while for the viscosity or the way that your blood's going to interact with the environment to change." And this is something we see with people all the time. People who move to a cold climate from a hot climate like India or Africa, and they come in their 40s and 50s, they never acclimate to the weather in any real way. Whereas those who grow up here or come at a young age, they do acclimate. These things happen. And there are other examples we could talk about. But that is not evolution in the sense of the Darwinian model. The Darwinian model of evolution, which is really what people mean when they say evolution, and we'll talk about how the term evolution is equivocal as we go on here. But the Darwinian model, which Tucker Carlson puts forth, is really that in the beginning, not the Bible beginning, because the Bible's a fairy tale, but evolution is science. In the beginning, there was the sludge. And in the sludge, there was a single cell organism. No one tells you how the sludge got there or how the cell got there, which is, we'll talk about that, why it's really pantheism ultimately. But in the beginning, there was the sludge, and in the sludge, there was the single cell, and in the single cell, there was the potential to go blah, 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 and it splits off and it creates whatever. And finally, you get from the point of having a single cell all the way through these transitionary species of different types of plants and animals and birds and insects and mammals and whatever. And X amount of millions of years later, or billions of years later, now Joe Rogan, the very evolved man with his evolved ideas, is talking to Tucker Carlson, who the world would call less evolved because he doesn't understand the truth of evolution the way the evolutionists do. And they're talking on microphones being streamed through a computer to people around the world. And look at that, we've evolved from the single cell. So for that to be true, as Carlson says, there must be the transitionary fossils in the fossil record. It's just not there. It's never been discovered. That was one of the prerequisites for taking this theory. And I do understand that certain people who are going to complain to me in the comments, there is a difference between a hypothesis and a theory. And because something is called a theory in science does not mean we use that term theory in science the same way we do in regular language. In regular language, you might say, I have a theory, when really what you should probably say is, I have a hypothesis. The difference is essentially the following. A hypothesis is basically, I have an idea, I want to test that idea. That's kind of hypothesis. A theory is, I started with a hypothesis and I worked it out to the point where it had sort of a system of logic that worked therein in the parameters that I've set. I've done my best to test that beyond kind of, or to a point where I'm confident that this is a possibility. And now I can put this forth as a potential theory for inquiry and scientific discussion. That's really what a theory is. So a theory is higher than a hypothesis, but a theory still doesn't mean something is proven. Although many people do operate in the scientific world as if theories themselves are proven. And another major problem too, sorry if I'm kind of going all over the place here, but it's really important. Another really important too is that in the scientific literature and talking to scientists, and I've talked to many scientists who are pro-evolution who want to convince me that I'm a bumbling, toothless fundamentalist for being a creationist. Excuse me. The problem is that the language used by modern man in general, but especially in the secular sciences, is completely nominalist. It's completely equivocal. The words mean whatever you want them to mean, and you can change those definitions over time. So what Carlson was saying is that there must be a fossil record. Well, we don't see the fossil record. And as Carlson says, we have none, zero. We don't. The closest thing that we've seen, or the most convincing thing that we've seen, which is becoming less and less convincing from the basics perspective of the data, has been the types of hominids. So this idea that there are, certain types of proto-human ape-like creatures. And in fact, if you still go on Wikipedia today, I wanted to know something about chimpanzees the other day because for some reason, I looked up chimpanzees and it's chimps, gorillas, and orangutans and humans that are all called great apes. We are great apes, by the way. I know I am a little bit furry, but I don't think I'm an ape. And great apes include human beings, and we all go back to this whatever, this proto-whatever ape thing. And that really is Darwinian evolution. It's the idea that we've all come from this tree of life, and there's the transitionary periods, whatever. At a certain point in history, the idea is that there is this primordial ape, which no one has ever discovered, by the way. It doesn't exist in any, as Tucker Carlson says, there's no evidence, none, zero. We don't have that. But for this theory to work, it must be there. And we go from this transitionary, or this primordial ape-like creature, and from there, we sort of go off and this ascent towards different speciation, and certain animals come off at different layers, and they become their own distinct species, but we're all part of the same originating kind, if that makes sense, and therefore we are all part of the ape family. That's the belief, and that's very Darwinian. Now, there is no evidence for this with human beings as much as they want there to be. As Carlson says, there is none. There is zero. What we have instead now with the modern literature on the hominid species, and again, look at my video with John Wynn. We talked about hominids. It's on my channel. It's not hard to find. In fact, maybe I'll just show you quickly what that video looks like so you can look it up after. So here's that video. I'm not going to play it right now, but it's called Did Humans Really Evolve from Apes? Evolutionary historian John Wynn. And this is my creation series. And we talk about a lot of things in there. And if I just kind of go through, I'll show you an image of that. So he has, you can see on the screen here, he has that chart there that we go over with the different fossils and things. And he shows what was traditionally believed in the sort of late 1800s, and the sort of 20th century about this hominid chain and how this corresponds to what was proposed, but what we actually know now. And it's really not what you think it is at all. And his evidence here is literally only from mainstream scientific journals. It's not from, creationist.com or whatever. And so I recommend you check that out because it is very fascinating. It's called Didn't Humans Really Evolve from Apes? We go over this for about an hour and a half. It's pretty comprehensive. So the idea that there is this transitionary forms, we've never found it. It doesn't exist. Even if one were to argue that it's potentially possible, it's not there. And what we do find instead, when we go through the secular literature, even if we take the the dates of the modern scientists at face value, it's billions of years old, hundreds of thousands, whatever. Scrap the biblical timeline for just a second. Even if we take that, what we find is a lot of nothing, and then boom, overnight, seemingly we find a lot of something. And that's called the Cambrian explosion. This is what, for example, places like the Discovery Institute, which does a lot of good work debunking Darwinian evolution, they're not young Earth creationists, they're old Earth creationists. And then, of course, with places like the Kolbe Center, which is a very traditionally Catholic young Earth creationist apostolate, there you'll find different explanations for that. But either way, all of the people who reject the sort of Darwinian model, they find that that there is no way to account for this gradualism of the different forms. The fossil record, meaning the actual evidence, does not support it. As I mentioned, the hominid record really just shows us we have kind of apes, maybe some that went extinct, and then we have people of different shapes and sizes, and they're just people, and that's it. We just have apes and people. We don't have apes, proto-human ape, proto-ape, like this up and we don't have that. It's not there. And we have this explosion of new life forms, and we have no idea from whence they came. They just come out of nowhere in what's called the Cambrian explosion. The Cambrian explosion is X amount of hundreds of thousands or millions of years ago. But the point being is that there's a lot of nothing and a lot of something. There are no transitionary fossils. Now, the evolutionist dogmatists will find ways around this to explain why that's still evolution. And this is the reason why. And if you watch my video, perhaps if I just pull it up quickly, with Dr. Romulo, I can just pull this up on my screen here without playing it. And in this video, evolutionary biologist with PhD from Oxford discusses problems with neo-Darwinism. He shows in this, using just the secular literature, just the stuff that's in his purview, in his work as a mainstream scientist, he shows that equivocally, or the word evolution is used equivocally. So, for example, if someone says, well, we've proven evolution, they can say that with a straight face because they include everything that is microevolution, like the breeding of dogs or the adaptation to circumstances. They show that as evolution, so that's proven. And they also include under evolution, the umbrella of evolution, this idea of these quantum leaps in types that are explained by transitionary fossils. And if that doesn't work, then anything and everything is evolution. He shows an example of how it's been proven with these types of tadpoles where initially they're omnivores. They eat both meat and vegetable matter. And if you feed them a certain way from basically their infancy, the actual functioning of their stomach capacity, of their intestinal system, will change to the point where they become herbivores, or they become carnivores. So they actually change, and then I believe that's actually seen in their offspring. That's very fascinating. That is still an adaptation to a circumstance, and it's a contrived circumstance that only happens in a lab because you're making it happen, which requires really some sort of intelligent design, which is not the same thing as evolution anyway. But that, he said, amongst evolutionists is considered evolution. They say, look, well, this is possible, but we're still not getting beyond Darwin's hypothesis that because finch beaks evolve or adapt to certain circumstances, therefore we could expect to see greater adaptations, which really means going from one species to another. And even there is a problem there, because within the evolutionary paradigm, the language is completely equivocal, even with words like species. So Dr. Romulo explained this to me, that for some evolutionary theorists, a species means it can breed with another animal. So, for example, a horse can breed with a donkey and they get a mule. Mules are not always infertile, most of the time, not always. But because a mule and a donkey can breed with one another, a horse and a donkey can breed with one another, therefore they must be of the same species. That's one definition of species. Others believe that the horse and the donkey are not of the same species, so then for them, different species can breed with one another, which you can see how this would help their evolutionary claims. For others, they use words like genus, or they'll use words in a more biblical sense, which probably are the best words, and they'll say things like kinds. So for example, we have everything from little tabby cats, house cats, to lions. And although a lion, and I don't think they can, I've looked into it, I don't think you can have tigers and lions breed with house cats. I think it's been attempted, and maybe it's happened once or twice or something. I'm not up to date on the literature on that, but I don't think they can. But nonetheless, we see them as cat-like creatures. The biblical understanding, which makes a lot of sense, is that God creates different kinds of animals. And then within there, you have these kind of branching off based on adaptation to circumstances. So even there, you have this equivocation of the word species, which leads to a difference in the equivocation, or a confusion with the equivocation of the word evolution, and therefore everything is evolution and nothing is evolution. And this is kind of the problem you ultimately get to. You get to with this conversation, because when you're talking to a man like Joe Rogan, who has no comprehensive philosophy whatsoever and is mind-numbingly frustrating with his contradictions, when you get to a man like Joe Rogan, or talking to the average person, and I think one of the reasons he's so popular is he does represent kind of the average questioning intellect for someone who has no philosophical formation, and therefore everything is possible and nothing is possible. These words don't mean anything. These words don't mean anything. Evolution is whatever you want it to be. Evolution is everything from tadpoles changing the way they eat meat and plant matter, to mules, to hominids, to single-celled organisms becoming birds, to whatever. It's literally whatever you want. Evolution is whatever you want. Here's the thing. This ultimately points to the fact that we have a massive philosophical problem. And this is really at the root of this is the philosophical heresy of nominalism, is that you can basically just change the meanings of words because the things that you're talking about don't have essences or natures. This is completely contradictory to Thomistic metaphysics, which is very confusing because there are some Thomists out there who will argue that it's possible for there to be evolution amongst the species in the Darwinian sense based on Thomism. The thing is, even if it were possible to argue that, and it's not really possible in my opinion, even though they can kind of play with words here and there to make it happen, but even if that was possible, there's still no evidence of it. It's kind of like Chesterton said, in his book Orthodoxy. He talks about the madman and how the madman, when he lives inside his closed system of logic, it's impenetrable. He says a man who believes that everything is a conspiracy against him, if you try to convince him that nothing is a conspiracy against him, then he would say that's exactly what the person who's conspiring against him would say, And there's no way to convince somebody out of a closed system when they've come to believe that all of these hypothetical possibilities are in fact possible, and there's nothing to universally disprove that claim. And that's the thing about most of the things in human knowledge, is that, as Chesterton also said, it's really impossible to I think he said, prove a universal negative, in the sense that, if somebody says, well, isn't it possible that if you have 1 billion years and this many things and blah, 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 da, 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 and then couldn't this happen? It's like, well, I actually can't prove to you that that would never happen because I can't actually test that. All I can do is say, this doesn't match everything we know about everything and all things that are known about reasonable things. I used to have conversations with my students, and there was some students who were distinctly atheist, and they'd bring up things like, well, Mr. Hall, evolution is possible because For example, if you put laundry in a dryer, and mathematically, if you run enough cycles, at some point the laundry has to come out properly folded. And I would say, well, for one, that would never happen. But mathematically, if it's possible, okay, fine. But secondly, there's still another issue with that, because you have a dryer which was designed and it can only spin in a certain way, which was how it was designed to by the designer. So it's not even really random in the first place because it requires a certain type of design to it. But evolutionists never really consider these things in its fullness because they have no consistent metaphysics. And here's the reason why. And Rogan goes on to, kind of trying to poke fun at Carlson because he believes something that everybody believed till 100 years ago. And Rogan thinks, aren't we smarter today? And Carlson has a good response and basically says, no, we're not. I mean, goodness gracious, look at the elites who are trying to wipe out the human race. True. But I would go one further than that. And I would say, it's not that we're not smarter than our ancestors in certain ways. Obviously, there are lots of technological advancements. But these technological advancements are kind of relative. There's a comedian one time I heard a joke, and he was making fun of how we always think we're so advanced because of our technology. And he said, he's at the office and he's photocopying something. And he's like, oh man, this is so great. What did those idiots do back then? And then he says, imagine 50 years ago before photocopiers, whenever it was, and instead of photocopying, you have a typewriter. And they're typing out this thing that someone wrote, and they're going, oh man, this is so much better than having to write this out by hand. I wonder what those idiots did back then. And he says, go back 1,000 years to a monastery, and there's a ton of monks copying out these manuscripts by hand on these codexes and so forth. And one looks at the other one and says, oh man, this is so advanced. I wonder what those idiots did back then. You keep going back. We always think we're the most advanced. But that's not really what we're talking about there are functional intelligences based on a continual experience with certain things and a certain material phenomenon. And the way that those advancements work is they always work exponentially. But the fact that they work exponentially is not indicative of the fact that we're smarter for having them. The man who spent the civilization that first figured out a real good irrigation system, for example, for farming. That seems to us like a super rudimentary thing now. But they were adapting to what was possible in a given circumstance and using the tools available to do so. But then having an irrigation system, it goes from one advancement to an exponential shift in farming in general. And then from there, you have an exponential shift in farming from there. And because you have more food and because you have a greater reliance on crops and you have more storage and things like that, now you don't have to worry about certain survival techniques to the same way that your ancestors did. And then from there, you have an exponential ability to spend time on certain things that you couldn't have spent time on in the past. It doesn't mean we're smarter. In fact, it means that we should be grateful. And in our day, we have these monumental discoveries of radio technologies, wireless technologies, electricity, and so forth. And because of the exponential nature of what has come off of that, we have been able to really expand our ability to do certain things technology. But none of these are proof that we are smarter. They're really just proof of the fact that we have things that smart people gave us, and they made it so that we didn't have to worry about the things they had to worry about, so then we could focus on the things that they actually prepared for us. It doesn't mean we're less smart in the technological sense. Of course, we're very intelligent in the technological sense, but it does not prove that we have some sort of higher intelligence or understanding of the world per se. We just have different tools that we use. And Carlson is right that we actually have a worse understanding of the world if we're talking about the realm of those things that are unchanging, metaphysical, and permanent. We have a terrible metaphysics, and this really will affect ultimately our use of technology. We have all the technology in the world, but we don't understand, to go back to the beginning of the conversation between Carlson and Rogan. We are now, the most popular English-speaking podcaster in the world, I think he has the most downloads, is having a conversation about the importance of human beings. This was kind of worked out a long time ago, wasn't it? Let us make man in God's image. That's kind of been known for a long time. But we're so smart nowadays that we have to try to figure out whether man is really important or not. Really, we're not that smart. And ultimately, this goes back to a deeper problem. You see, historically, really there are two philosophies. There are really two philosophies that every human being and every civilization in the history of mankind has believed in. On the one hand, you have theism, which is belief in a creator god or creator gods. On the other hand, you have pantheism, which is a belief that the divine and the created order are really one and the same. So one might say, well, isn't there paganism? Paganism is a mixed bag. Pagans can be pantheists. Pagans can be theists. Often, there are a bunch of both. Paganism really is, the word pagan really stems back to this idea of folk belief. And more often than not, you find paganism in the sense of how it's practiced with individual peoples is really a form of superstition. Of course, there's a devil worship aspect, but before we even get into the spiritual reality of it, just the psychological impetus for it, it really is a type of superstition. So we have theism and we have pantheism. Theism is this idea that the creator god or creator gods are separate from the creation. So even if you look into a lot of the beliefs of these ancient pagans who have their different gods of nature and so forth, for example, the natives of Canada and North America, they may have all these myths and stories about these sort of demiurges and demigods who create certain things, but they'll always point to this idea that there's this great spirit. And the great spirit stands outside the creation. He is not the creation. He is subsistent in himself, and he creates the thing from his completely sovereign will. That's kind of the idea. This is where all monotheistic religions come from. And even in the religions where they have the lower gods, they still point to this higher god who is not of the pantheon of gods. This is really theism. Pantheism, which is really the ancient religion of the East. Hinduism is not a good term, in my opinion, for how we talk about it, because really in ancient Indian literature, you have lots of different religions, but really we've classified everything on the other side of the Indus River, Hindus, that's where the word comes from. We've kind of classified all of them as being Hindus. But really in India, you have massively different traditions. In fairness, I mean, there are plenty of pagans for sure. And the sort of modern Hindu is very much a mix of a pantheist and a pagan with a superstitious believer with a fatalist system. But you do have these ancient philosophies, this sort of Vedantic religion, which although pantheistic, is metaphysically a lot more sound than colloquial Hindu paganism. In any case, the pantheist ultimately believes that there is this divine reality, which is one with the created reality. So this is why modern man, who talks about religion in his stupid modern way in the West, he's a post-Christian, philosophically bankrupt fool, and he talks about how I believe in the universe. What does it even mean? You believe in the universe? Well, it means that you believe that the universe is divine, which is completely consistent with pantheism. So you see this fleshed out in some of the Eastern religious schools. So there's this notion of Brahman and Atman, essentially. And I'm using very Cole's Notes kind of terminology here for the sake of this conversation. So Brahman is the ultimate spirit, so to speak, the everything. And the Atman is sort of the individualized pieces or so of this Brahman spirit. This is why in Eastern religions you have reincarnation. Because really, there is this spiritual, divine, material, hybrid essence, which is the universe and all that is within, and there's no beginning and there's no end. And from there, you have this interaction of these individualities, which are human beings and other creatures, but they're really all just part of Brahman. They're part of this spiritual, continual, permanent, eternal, universal deity. And therefore, when they die, they go back to Brahman. This is why you have the cycles of reincarnation and stuff. So there is no separation between the creation and the creator. So really, there is no creator and there is no creation. In order for there to be a creation, there must be a creator. They must be separate. Theism is the opposite. There is the creator who is sovereign, who has no beginning and no end, and his creation is not the same thing. The evolutionist is a pantheist, and modern man is largely a pantheist. The modern man essentially believes, through his evolutionary belief, which is really a pantheism, He believed that there's this continual cycle of destruction and growth and destruction and growth. And from there, the universe continues to develop and progress to a certain point where at a certain point, there's going to be some sort of culmination. But the problem is with pantheism is that there is no ending because there is no beginning, because otherwise it's not pantheism. Because pan meaning everything and theo meaning God, everything must be God, which means all that is can't go away because God won't go away. So with pantheism, there really is no ending because there really is no beginning. And this is consistent with Big Bang cosmology. Big Bang cosmology, people think, and this is why I find it so frustrating when Catholics will argue from these perspectives, they don't actually, the secular scientists, they don't actually believe the Big Bang is the beginning. They don't believe that. There's no consensus, but generally speaking, they don't believe that. They don't believe that the Big Bang came from nothing. They believe that the Big Bang is one of many bangs, one of many restarts or whatever, one of many expansions of materiality from some sort of singularity and so forth, and this immensely dense whatever. They believe that the Big Bang is one of many goings out and comings back, going out and coming back. You know, this intense starting point that is the result of a destabilization point, and then it comes in on each other, and then it goes out to a new thing. This is Big Bang cosmology. It's really a pantheistic, cyclical nature of growth and death, and growth and death. It's pantheistic, it's Kabbalistic, and in this, there is no, when you follow this model, it destroys the ability for there to be anything such as objective morality. And the reason why it destroys this is because inherent in pantheism, there's no separation between creator and creation, because there is no creator and creation, which means that all those things that exist both exist and don't exist at the same time. Think about that for a second. And because there is no distinction between the divine and the created, because there is no divine and there is no created, but everything is divine and all that is created is divine, it's a paradox. It's not really a paradox. It's a contradiction. There can be no categories. There can be no categories that have distinct limits. Here's what I mean. I say something is right and something is wrong because there is a permanent metaphysical, i.e., non-physical, spiritual gauge, standard of what is true and what is false. I say that something is this way and something is not that way. That means the thing being this way must be separate from the thing being that way. This is only possible when we have a metaphysics where there is a creator who is separate, who makes a creation that is separate. Now, he can obviously interact. We're not even getting into Christian theology here, but just for the basic philosophical perspective. So because of this, because of theism, because of this divine wellspring who is his own subsistent thing, giving us something that's dependent on him, there's an actual limitation and separation of us from him in some way. And therefore, what we do in our lives here on earth, there are things that are in categories with limits because things here are limited. But if we are part of this pantheistic creation, there are no limits because there is no time, because there is no anything, because there's no beginning and there's no end. And it's really just cyclical, and ultimately it's meaningless and it's fatalist. And this is what ultimately these people believe. This is the movie The Matrix. Matrix is a funny movie because on the one hand, it's very Christian in the sense that it's very Platonic in the good sense. On the other hand, and there's lots of Christian imagery as there always is. For example, the girl's name is Trinity, and the Neo is Anderson is his last name. So Anderson means son of man. He's the new son of man, and he dies and comes back to life because of the tears of the Trinity. Anyway, it's a very Christian thing. And really getting out of the Matrix is really the allegory of the cave, which can be reconciled with Christianity very easily. Nonetheless, it's also a very Gnostic and pantheistic film because there's that point where Neo is talking to that kid who's sort of this Buddhist monk in training in this Matrix world, and he looks at the spoon and he says, "There is no spoon." And it's like, whoa, there is no spoon. And if you understand there is no spoon, then you can understand everything. Okay, fine. But the point is when you fall into this pantheistic world of thinking, there is no spoon, because there is no limit. There can be no limits, because for limits there must be beginnings and ends. But in a creation which is not a creation, where there are no beginnings and ends, there can be no things in that sense. And when you follow these theories through, you get to the point where you start to believe this stuff. You know, the Hindus would tell us about, and again, Hinduism is problematic, but they would talk about how really we just have avatars of the gods. And really, you know, yes, you're a human being, but you're not really a human being. You're just Atman, who's in a sort of fleshly cage. This is really Gnosticism, right? There's the ghost in the machine, which is what Descartes believed. This is why the church is going through such a struggle with her metaphysics, is because largely she's accepted, or the philosophers of the church have largely accepted Cartesian metaphysics, which is really just a form of Gnostic pantheistic metaphysics. But anyway. And because of this, you have ultimately the caste system. This is why if you go to a place like India, where they're sort of simultaneously pantheists, but also pagans, which means they're superstitious, and the true pantheists are not superstitious, in fairness to the Vedantic spiritual masters. I don't agree with them, but their logic is actually kind of consistent. And as an aside, C.S. Lewis, if you read his biography, his autobiography, Surprised by Joy, which is his spiritual journey, he goes through how when he came to believe that there was a divine reality and he was no longer an atheist, he came to believe that he either had to be a pantheist or a theist. Because rightfully so, he said, really it was the Vedantic masters of the East who followed this pantheism to its logical conclusion. Really, they had a consistent metaphysic within their closed system, and the theists did as well. He was obviously convinced to be a Christian, and he believed Hinduism was wrong, but he had a point there. And and again, we're not talking about divine revelation and all those kinds of things as well. But so my point being, though, is when you follow this pantheistic Hindu Eastern, which is really evolution, because evolution is pantheism, if you think about it, right? You have this creative thing, this source, and from there, everything comes up and nothing is really separate. And because of that, there's no distinctions. And therefore, Joe Rogan can say things like, well, human beings are important, but because he doesn't really think that human beings are separate from the beasts, because there really is no separation from the beasts, because we're all part of the same thing, and we come from the same thing, and we go back to the same thing, and we come from the same thing, and we go back to the same thing. And this life of material is really just a passing phase that is a cage for our spirit, which is really not spirit, because it's part of the created order, which is not created, which is consistent with the divine order, which is really not much different than the material. And around we go until we lose our minds. That's what pantheism ultimately leads to. This is why you have the caste system in India. Why? Well, because a system where, I mean, to this day, I talk to missionaries who are in India, for example. To this day, you can walk through a major urban center in India, and there can be someone dying on the side of the road, literally dying, or being, with open wounds, maggots, going after their wounds, but they're still technically alive. And you can walk over that body, and no one picks up the body, and no one's committed any crime. And why is that? Well, ultimately, because that person has no value, and the person stepping over them have no value. Because they don't really exist, do they? Because there is no spoon. You see where this goes? If you're just Atman, as part of the Brahman, then everything that happens to you is deterministic. Because you're here, because you're reincarnated, because of the things that were done in the past, and it's just this cyclical thing where this created order, which isn't created, is going through, blah, blah, blah. And eventually you'll get to this point. And we found this in the church, and this has really been incarnated in Teilhard de Chardin, who gave us his point omega, which is this evolutionary apex and this ending point where we go to. Anyway, I'm kind of rambling at this point. I hope you're enjoying it, though. But this is the problem with this evolutionary thinking, is it's not just about hominids and material things. It's really a completely metaphysically bankrupt system, which has no foundation in anything verifiable, both in the spiritual, metaphysical, or corporeal material world. It is broken from beginning to end. And that's the problem with Joe Rogan's belief, which is the belief of so many. That's the problem with Catholic theistic evolutionists, is yes, they stick to the revelation and the teachings of the church, but they really are giving a hat tip to this philosophy, which ultimately leads to a completely fatalistic, nihilistic, deterministic outlook where nothing matters. And the only cure for this is the Christian faith. That's it. No other metaphysical system can really protect against this. And this is why ultimately we have such a problem with depression. I mean, there's more reasons for that, but one of the main reasons why we have such a problem with depression in our day is because man has engaged this pantheism, and he believes ultimately that he doesn't matter, because of course he doesn't. Because like Joe Rogan said, ultimately people are important, but it's like, yeah, I'm important, but really I'm just an ape. And I will say this as well, in fairness to the real pantheists. You see, Western proto-pantheists or pseudo-pantheists, like your average person who is baptized as a Catholic but does yoga, right? Western pseudo-pantheists they have not only a bankrupt metaphysics, but they have an insufferably egotistical metaphysics. And here's why. This is the last point I'll make. I'm coming on an hour here. I thought I was going to do this for 20 minutes. The reason is, you see, if you're in a Christian society, even if you don't believe it, you necessarily believe that you actually have value. You believe that because your legal system, your fairy tales, everything has led you to believe that you have value and that you should be respected because there's something special about you. And that special thing is the fact that you're made in the image and likeness of God. This is how Christianity has been weaponized in a post-Christian culture to advocate for things like transgender surgeries for children. Is because it's based on this notion of compassion, that we should have compassion for the poor children who are feeling sad, and we should give them the surgery that makes them feel better. This is why it's so hard to fight against this in a post-Christian society, because we have this right belief that people have value and deserve care. And they deserve care because we're made in the image and likeness of our Creator, ultimately. There's more to it, but that's an important part. But you see, this modern Western post-Christian who has adopted this pantheism, he's a monstrosity. And the reason he's a monstrosity is as follows. You see, when you look in the East to these pantheistic cultures, and we haven't even talked about how the fact that communism is also pantheism and atheism is pantheism. That's maybe another podcast for another day. So really a place like China really is still pantheistic. Anywhere where you have this idea that you can sacrifice amounts of people for the greater good of the whole must necessarily be materialistic, but ultimately pantheistic, because there is no person, therefore there is no sin in killing the innocent person, because no one is innocent and no one is guilty, because there's no morality, because there's no limits. Anyway. But what we have in the West is when we compare them to the East, in the East, they believe that ultimately there is no spoon, right? They believe that ultimately they go through this life to go to the next life. They go back to this life to go to the next life, and we've been through this. So really, they don't actually believe in themselves. They don't believe in their self. They don't really think there is a self in the sense that we do. We have a unique soul that's created at a certain moment and doesn't die. It either goes up or down, heaven or hell. Or doesn't end, I should say. There is a type of death in hell. But anyway, we have a soul that has a beginning, created intentionally by God, and it's not God. Whereas the Atman of the pantheist is God, but really is kind of a piece of God that's resorbed in God. In the West, we have this muddled metaphysics where we are Christians, where we believe that we are special and we have rights and that we should be taken care of and that we should be happy, which are all true in a sense. But we have this pantheistic belief that really we are all part of this greater cosmos, and there's really no difference between the worm and the gnat and the dog and the squirrel and the human being, so we're environmentalists and blah, blah, blah. But the problem is that our conception of the divine is completely different from the East. In the East, the divine reality is not an awesome creative force that is completely powerful, omniscient, etc. In the West, we believe about the divine reality the things that we know from Christianity, that God is awesome, that God is a creator, that God is invincible, that God is omniscient, he knows all things, and so forth. So in the East, when they view themselves as parts of this divine reality, that's not something that brings them happiness. That's not something that they think gives them power. That's something that means that ultimately they go to nothingness. In the West, we take these pantheistic beliefs that we like because it gets us out of having to have morals, but we still hold on to this conception we have of God. So when the Western man adopts his pantheism, he's really a muddled monstrosity of theism with this awesome creator God and a pantheist who believes he's a piece of God. This is why in the West, this adoption of these pantheistic beliefs has led to an intense egotism. In the East, there is no ego because there is no self. In the West, we do have a self. So we can say ego, I, right? That's what ego means, I. We can say I. But the problem is that as a Christian, I believe that I am subject to I am. But a post-Christian muddled pantheist in the West believes he's I and that he's part of God. But he believes about God the things that I believe about God. So he believes that him being with God and about God and part of God makes him into a God. See the problem there? This is why the most insufferable philosophies are the self-help philosophies, where the whole world revolves around you. And this is modern, post-Christian, Western pseudo-pantheism. In the East, people do not go to yoga studios because they want to feel really good about themselves. In the West, people go to yoga studios because they want to feel really good about themselves. Because in the East, they have no selves. But here, it's only the self. Western post-Christian pantheist man has turned himself into God. And he has a completely monstrous metaphysical conundrum to deal with because he believes there is no spoon, but he is God. It's a very strange thing. There's more I could say, but that's it. As always, let me know what you think in the comments. This has been the Kennedy Report. Until next time, God bless.